So my name is Linda and I'm here with my colleagues Elin and Gustaf, and we're going to do a bit of a team effort today, as is quite usual at Nordic. We're going to talk a bit. We're going to sort of have, I guess, three main parts of the presentation today. So we'll start off by looking at Swedish population trends in a Nordic context. And I think we'll move through this fairly quickly. We have sort of quite a lot of maps and we'll cover them relatively quickly. The aim here is just to, for those of you who are not so familiar with the Swedish context, to give some insights into what did the population trends look like before 2020. If it moves a little bit too fast, don't worry, all the maps will be made available afterwards. So, but I'll do my best to be as clear and concise as possible. And then we'll move on to looking at, I think, something that's quite interesting, as Sverker pointed out, in the Nordic context and the Swedish context is this notion of multilocality. So I think the statistics can only tell us so much about the way that people move around and what's going on between urban and rural areas, because we also know that we have a lot of movement that we can't track with statistics through, for example, the use of second homes. And then we'll move on to the real sort of meat of the day, which is what are the implications of the pandemic on population trends. And here we have a specific focus on the impact of the accelerated trend towards remote work on population trends. And I guess, to be clear, I think it's kind of interesting to be talking about a post-pandemic world in a context where we're still so much in the middle of the pandemic. So I should just stress that these are obviously quite preliminary reflections and hopefully good meat for discussion rather than very clear conclusions in this third part. And before we do all that, though, maybe it's worth telling you a little bit about Nordic, because some of you might be familiar, but perhaps others not so much. So Nordic is an international research centre for regional development and urban planning, and we're part of the Nordic Council of Ministers family. So we study Sweden, but we pretty much always study Sweden in the context of the Nordic region, and most of the maps we'll present today will be Nordic maps. We're about 45 researchers from across the Nordic region and around the world, actually, and we work on a broad range of research topics. But we have, I guess you can say, two main interests that span across all of our work. So first, we want to know how a particular phenomenon might play out differently in the different countries and why, how we might explain that. And secondly, we want to know how this phenomenon might play out differently in different types of regions and municipalities, regardless of which country they're in. And of course, again, why that might be the case. And often both these things are sort of happening at the same time, which is when it gets, I think, really interesting. So a quick whistle-stop tour through Swedish population trends in a Nordic context. I think starting with a very basic indicator of national population change. You can see here on the slide that Sweden is actually one of the countries that's experienced the largest population growth. In this case, we look at the Baltic Sea region area, and we start in 1990 at the beginning of the graph, and basically all of the lines that are heading upwards those countries have experienced population growth since 1990, and the ones below that are heading downwards, they've experienced decline. But we know, even though Sweden has experienced perhaps more population growth during this period than the other countries, we know that this hasn't been exactly evenly distributed. So as in most of the other Nordic countries, most pronounced growth has been in the larger urban areas. So here we see that functional urban areas throughout the Nordics have been increasing by an average of at least 5% every year since 2020, and up to 2017 is shown on this map. And when we talk about functional urban areas, we're talking about populations over 55,000 and sort of labour market regions, so not necessarily municipal boundaries. And at the same time, as we see these functional urban areas growing, we know that many rural areas have been losing population. So here in this map, we see the blue areas have been growing, and the municipalities shaded in red have been shrinking at different rates. And if we look at Sweden specifically, I think two things really stand out for me. The first being, actually, there's quite a bit of blue on this map. So things are not looking so grim as perhaps for some of our neighbours across the Baltic. The other thing, though, that I think stands out quite clearly is this north-south divide. So we see a lot more population decline in the northern part of the country than in the south. And there's a couple of things that are contributing to this situation. And the first, something that we talk quite a lot about, is the outmigration of young people. And I think this is perhaps one of the most striking maps that I've seen in my time at Nordic. This is internal net migration of 20 to 29-year-olds from 2010 to 2019. So basically anything red, we see net outmigration of this group. Perhaps less striking, but maybe more interesting, is if we take the same map and we look at the next age group, so the next stage of life from 30 to 39. And here we actually see a much more mixed and perhaps somewhat more positive picture from a regional development perspective. And in the context of the current debates around the remote work and I guess outmigration from cities, it's quite interesting, I think, to think about who are those that kind of move back. And interestingly, I mean, even though we're increasingly discussing this idea of these sort of footloose people that can work from anywhere, we know that according to the literature, historically, the most common groups who are returning to rural areas are actually in high proximity jobs, which are high proximity but actually exist everywhere. So, for example, nursing, teaching, other public sector professions. So the second important trend is, of course, population ageing. And here, let's see if we get this GIF to work. This is a time series of the old age dependency ratio in the Nordic region. So here we can see the development over time of the old age dependency ratio. So the portion of the population, the population over 65 as a proportion of the working age population. And we see, of course, that it's across the board, it's getting darker, the map. But we also see that, particularly in rural areas, it's getting darker more quickly. And then we take a small look to the future. So same indicator, old age dependency ratio. And we see that actually, if we look to the future, the projections are actually even more extreme. So with the population over 65 predicted to outnumber the working age population in many municipalities. And a lot of these are actually rural municipalities. And finally, coming back to our original, more simple indicator of population change, again, looking ahead to the 1930s, this map shows looking back a little bit backwards and a little bit forward. So looking at the decades from 1990 to 1930, to 2030, sorry, when is the kind of peak of population? So the decade with the lowest average population size. So the basic sort of takeaway from this map is that any of the municipalities that are shaded in green are likely to have the lowest, their population will be at its lowest point within this period in 2030. And the municipalities shaded in brown, they're actually the ones that are growing. So again, we see a little bit more. Actually, looking forward, we start to see in Sweden, even in the south, some of these municipalities showing a trend towards shrinking. But as I said, all of these maps are telling a particular story based on the permanent population. So the statistics can only really tell us about where people live. So we can only register ourselves at one address here in Sweden. So it's, I think, another interesting dynamic to look at is how the flow of people to second homes might change this urban-rural dynamic in different ways. So I'd like to introduce my colleague Elin Slätmo, who's going to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda. That's very nice of you. Exactly. It's a tradition since the beginning of urbanization in Sweden to have this type of access to, or to have remaining link to the rural areas with the with using the second home, so to say, or another farmstead that is used as a second home and not a permanent address. So in that sense, we can say it's quite of a long tradition. So in that sense, to have this access to second homes in Sweden and in Nordic countries. And this access then is an estimation that around half of the populations in Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Norway have access to second homes, and that either via ownership themselves or via family. So this type of access then enable new settlement patterns during the pandemic. So this type of multilocality is then enabled where broadband, already mentioned, and workplaces also allow, then you can work from your second homes. In the research literature, the second homers are called voluntary temporary inhabitants, in that sense that they are recognized as inhabitants to the local area where the second homes are located, but they are voluntary and temporary. In this temporal dimension is important because it can be traditionally during holidays and weekends, but frequently in the recent years it's also more frequent during shorter stays, during also weekends and so on. What is then a second home? So traditionally in the Nordic countries, a second home is means the detached house in a rural area where no one is permanently registered. But this type of definition is contested in that sense that it depends on in the country how it is defined in the statistics. But why do the Nordic people use or own a second home? Then talking about the situation before COVID, we can see that it's some kind of different types of motivations that make people want to use their second homes or have access to that. And that is social bonding with family and friends. It's to escape this busy urban life that have other types of values, such as access to nature and associated recreational activities. It's also one motivations to have it as an investment, it's a future investment. And finally, it's a possibility to have a type of generational living for parts of the year or during the summertime. You may be using the house to or the property to live together over several generations, but you don't live that like that permanently. So where are the second homes located? So as Linda said, we usually do studies with Sweden in the Nordic context, so also regarding the second homes. So the main areas for second homes, both in numbers and in relation to permanent inhabitants, are in Denmark. It's the northern Sjælland and the west coast of Jylland. It's the darkest blue colors on this map. And in Finland, it's in the mid-eastern lake areas and also in the southwest archipelago, including Åland. For Iceland, it's municipalities in proximity to Reykjavik, so in south of Iceland. And in Norway, it's in the southern mountain areas, in the Inlandet and Buskerud fylke. You can see the darkest color there. In Sweden, it's the patterns is a bit more scattered. There's several places that have this darkest of blue, and it's in the southern mountains area, both in Dalarna and in Jämtland Härjedalen, and in Stockholm and the Stockholm archipelago especially, and also in Öland. So this is where the second homes are located. That could indicate some things about the multilocality. And talking about indications and more general trends, so to say, regarding the settlement locations and urban-rural flows due to the second homes, we can see in this graph or in this table that the bar on the left is the population in permanent homes, and on the bar on the right is the populations in the second homes and where they are located, related to the urban-rural typology by the Eurostat. And the main message here is that the permanent homes are located primarily in urban areas. That is 60% sort of are in this red and pink colors. So that is the permanent homes are primarily located in the urban areas. And the second homes are then on the right side bar. Second homes are primarily located in the rural areas. So the 60% sort of are then in the rural areas. So in general terms, this means that is a when people are going from their permanent homes to their second homes, there's a continuous flow of people going from their urban areas to the rural areas. So, and they are doing that in a continuous way throughout the year, and they are doing it more both in weekends and holidays and so on, and they are doing it without it showing in the statistics, as we have already mentioned. So it's like based on the traditional statistics on the census, so to say, it's an invisible type of counter-urbanization. And this can, of course, be a bit challenging for planning and services, but it also enable us to have positive impact, such as in Härjedalen, which is then the areas, one of the areas in Sweden that has a lot of second homes. We interviewed a planner there, and this person says, that we have a lot of tourists leads to more shops in the settlements than we normally would have. We have more services in those settlements. If we would not have the tourism industry, there would not be even 3,000 inhabitants in the municipality. So that's just one of the voices for like the positive impacts from this voluntary temporary inhabitants. But at the same time, it's that these types of flows of people is not considered in the statistics means that they are not really fully considered in the regional development policy and planning. And it's important to try to incorporate them more clearly as the estimations and projections on the demand for local public and private services, because the provision of public services such as infrastructure, waste treatment, and social services are often then based on this census data that record people as living in one place only. And one reason, as I've already implicated, is that the second homes and the seasonal tourism implies these linkages between urban and rural areas, which complicate these strict categories used in statistics. But we will not stop there, of course, because we are trying to be focus on the solutions at Nordic Region. So then, therefore, to create a more correct basis for planning, we have developed an indicator called the community impact indicator. And this indicator and this map then show the impact of these temporary inhabitants to the municipalities. So that is one way that planner could use this map or this data to plan more accurately how many people that use the infrastructure and services throughout the year, considering also the second homes. So what this map is showing is the annual population in relation to the permanent population. And this community impacts, importantly, is that it's not just positive or negative, it's both at the same time. So positive impacts to the community due to second homes are, for instance, job creation and local and regional consumptions, and then also demand for events or restaurants and concerts and so on. Negative impact could also then be that more people use the infrastructures and services than planned for. With that, I thank you, and I'll leave the word back to Linda.
Thanks, Elin. So I think that I perhaps should have said at the beginning, this is research that Norrregio conducted prior to the pandemic, but I think that it still provides us with quite useful context for the next part of the presentation, which is to look at the implications of the pandemic on population trends. And I'll hand over to my colleague Gustaf to say some words about that.
Thank you so much, Linda. So we're going to have some trends during the pandemic, and also maybe some basis for discussion what will happen after the pandemic, whenever that will be. So this data is part of the State of the Nordic Region report that will come next year. So this is sort of a sneak peek to that. Of of course, the first thing to talk about is the remote working, and we all know that people are working remotely. We probably most of us have been working remotely during the pandemic, but still, it's not so easy to find data on how exactly how many has worked remotely during the pandemic. So here, Sweden is a good role model, I believe, because they extended their labor force survey during the pandemic to also incorporate the question on if people work remotely or not, and they have followed it up on a monthly basis. So these maps, they show first from the Q3 2020 and then the 3 first quarters in 2021, the share of people that have worked from home, and it's not necessarily that they worked full-time from home, but at least to some extent have worked from home. And first of all, the map shows the stages of the pandemic, with most people working from home in the Q1 2021, when it was a high spread here in Sweden. It was 42% then working from home overall, and then it's been decreasing a bit since then. So now in Q3 2021, it was 33% working from home. It's also a summer month, so it's usually a decrease there. So that you can take that into consideration. But what I think is most interesting in these maps is are the geographical differences. So if you look, for example, at the Q1 2021 there in the upper right corner, it was 56% in Sweden that was working from home, but you can compare that then to Dalarna, where it was only 27% of the people working from home. And I believe this mainly reflects the occupational structure in these regions. We have been using also this method that I'm sure many of you have seen this article from Dingle and Neyman that tried to assess how many of the jobs that could be done remotely. We also looked at this, and it correlates very well with this labor force survey data on how many that actually worked from home. So yeah, basically most jobs that can be made remote from home are right now located in these big urban regions. Yeah, so this was what has happened during the pandemic, but what will happen after the pandemic, of course, we don't know that, but we're allowed to speculate. So if you look at the next slide, Linda. So the COVID restrictions were lifted in Sweden in end of September. So we have now maybe 2 months at least, October, November, before new restrictions are coming, that we could get some glimpse maybe into how working life would be post-COVID, although we're not there yet. And so first of all, the labor force survey data from October now have come. So you could maybe then expect more people going back to work when the restrictions were lifted, but the data for October showed that still 33.3%, so a third of the labor force worked at least partly from home. And you can compare that to 35% in September, so only minor decrease. And also, interestingly, more people now say that they usually work from home rather than just do it temporary. And another way to look at this is what the map shows here, the data from the Google mobility. Google, as you know, they know where we live and they know where we work. So they can see how our work travel patterns have changed. And they have released this data now under COVID, the pandemic. And so we picked here a normal working day in November. November is considered a very standard month in the labor market period of the year. So it's the reference month also for the labor force, the big labor force survey. This is a normal Thursday in November, and then it was 20% less travels to work compared to the pre-pandemic baseline. So it says maybe something about the trend of more people working from home also after the pandemic. And the biggest decrease was in Stockholm with around 30%, and also Gothenburg and Malmö had we had recommendations, not restrictions. You're right, a good comment. but still the recommendations were lifted. And yeah, the biggest decrease in Stockholm and 30%, and then Gothenburg and Malmö had a 20% decrease. And the graph here shows the whole pandemic from the baseline there. So 0 is the pre-pandemic baseline, and all these spikes here are the holidays, so you can discard from them. But I think what I wanted to say here was that it seems to be quite a stable baseline of 20% decrease in work travels. So it's not it's not going up and down so much. It seems quite stable. But then, the big question: how will the possibility to work remotely affect the migration patterns? And I think you mentioned this, Sverker, very well. This basically shows exactly what you said about the internal net migration patterns for 2020. And so it's been a net out migration from the big urban regions like Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö. And you can see the same pattern in the other Nordic countries. So like Oslo, Helsinki, Copenhagen, Reykjavik had a quite stable, I think, not either in or out migration, but in general, an out migration from the big cities. And maybe you can show the next slide there. If you compare it to the before the COVID, to 2010, 2018 average, you can see that there is more blue on the map, on the 2020 map, basically showing that more regions have had in migration. That's what the blue means, and the red means out migration. And here I also highlighted the municipalities with the highest net in-migration rates. So you can see that they are located around the bigger, mainly around Stockholm actually. So it's municipalities like Trosa, Norrtälje, Österåker, Enköping, Strängnäs, close to Stockholm, and also Ystad and Örkelljunga in Skåne. So the ones that maybe stand out a bit more here is Åre, but as you mentioned, and Sverker, that would be a municipality with considered attractive, and that attracts a lot of tourism and so on. So if we want to reconnect also to the secondary homes, one way of looking at this is to see, because as Elin said, the definition of a summer house is that you are not registered there, and in Sweden, as long as the house fulfills some basic requirements, you can register there, and then it's not anymore considered a summer house but a permanent dwelling. So we wanted to see here if there's been any change here in 2020, if more summer houses have been transformed to permanent dwellings. And so the blue here on the map is a decrease in the number of summer houses, and the green is an increase in the number of summer houses. And you can see to the map to the left on the maybe I should say also that the prices has increased more for secondary homes than detached houses and apartments. So 20% price increase on secondary homes. But the map to the left shows the pre-pandemic situation, and even then you can see some blue areas there. But it's mainly then the municipalities around the big cities that we can see that more summer houses are being transformed to permanent dwellings. In 2020, you can see a lot more blue areas, so you could assume that maybe more people have moved permanently to their summer houses, and the biggest decrease then is in medium-sized cities such as Eskilstuna, Karlstad, Falun, and Halmstad. And maybe I could say also the biggest increase, because that also shows maybe where people, the multilocality aspect, the biggest increase was in Gotland, Älvdalen, Gällivare, Härjedalen, Bornholm, and Båstad. So quite typical tourist destinations, I would say. Yeah. Yes, that was some trends during COVID, and with that, I hand it back to Linda.
Thank you, Gustaf. Really interesting maps, and I think that gives us some insight into like the types of things that we are thinking about at Nordic Region and how we might try to study these trends going forward. I just want to finish our presentation by telling you a little bit about some of our ongoing work in this space. So one of the biggest parts of Nordic Region's work is the Nordic Cooperation Program for Regional Development and Planning. And that work is, we work together with senior officials and regional experts from around the Nordic countries, and we together develop research projects on issues that I guess are coming up in their day-to-day work. And actually, there are three groups. There's a group for rural development, a group for regional development, and a group for urban planning. And quite independently, all three groups sort of identified this as a really interesting issue that they wanted to study. And so the basic assumption is that, okay, we look at the COVID pandemic has caused a lot of workplace closures. We've seen a mainstream of remote working solutions for some workers. And the two kind of basic assumptions are that one, that if this would become a more long-term trend, that it will result in changes in commuting patterns, but also new preferences around where we want to live. So what we hope to study a little bit is what could be the impacts for different types of regions and what are the related planning implications. And we've started on a little bit on that work with two activities, and this here I'm going to come a bit more from a policy perspective than a statistical perspective, but basically just looking at how this issue of remote work and changing settlement patterns is being approached in the countries. So we've made quite a lot of interviews in the countries, mostly at the national level, looking at, I guess, three perspectives. So the perspective of workers through trade union associations, the perspective of business through different business associations, and the perspectives from the public sector. And I think the issues that are on the agenda with respect to remote work itself are quite similar. We're talking about work environment, we're talking about work-life balance, we're talking about equity issues in terms of who can work from home and who cannot. But when we think about the sort of multi-locality aspect, so the settlement patterns aspect, we see that all in the 5 countries, there are sort of different starting points, and then we kind of see different stories kind of emerging. So in Iceland, for example, the notion of jobs without placement, this was actually a policy priority already before the pandemic. So back in 2018, the Icelandic government set the goal that by 2024, 10% of all state jobs in Iceland would be advertised without placement. And actually, there's a very strong sort of equity aspect at the core of this policy. So the idea is that a person's right to serve their country by working for the state should not be determined by where they live. And actually, one thing that I find quite interesting about this policy, thinking back to the work environment point that I raised before, is that in the Icelandic policy, a job without placement doesn't necessarily imagine working from home. So they've actually mapped out all sorts of locations across the country where these placeless jobs could actually be situated. So the person is still expected to have the right to be an office environment, but just that doesn't necessarily need to be in Reykjavik. In Finland, the term here is multilocality, and it's very high on the political agenda. And actually, we've sort of adopted this term at Nordic Region, multilocality. But if you Google it actually in Swedish, if you Google multilocalitet, you actually find a lot of articles from Swedish-speaking Finns. It's very much a term that's not been used outside of Finland up until perhaps more recently. But actually, the Finnish government, as well before the pandemic, we're looking at how multi-local living, so spreading one's time between more than one residential location, could actually support them to address the quite grim, I would say, population trends that they are experiencing and the projections for rural areas. And so they started studying this trend already in January 2020, and we heard some sort of sneak previews into their results last month, and basically what they found was similar to the maps that Gustaf showed, that between Q1 and Q3 in 2021, the large cities were losing population for the first time in decades. And actually the winners were municipalities on the urban fringes, mid-sized cities and towns, and second home municipalities and tourist hotspots. So I think that report will be released early next year, and it gives quite a good indication, I would say, of how one might study these trends. Norway, I don't know if you noticed or picked up on the maps that I showed in the beginning. Norway has a long history of sort of delocalization policy and tends to have more balanced regional development in general. And I think the remote working and the multilocality narrative fits well with that, but it's not so clear at this stage exactly how. So there's definitely discussion that the ability to work from home could be something that could be of support to rural areas. But as far as we know, that the colleagues in Norway that work for the state have been actually told that they should go back to their offices, although that's likely changed now since we had that conversation with COVID restrictions. In Sweden as well, we see a lot of potential evident, but I must say that so far the implications for regional policy are not so clear. So we see some examples of things happening at the local level. The emergence of, for example, the Remote Lab, which is a Swedish startup looking at supporting companies who want to take follow the Icelandic example and go for jobs without placement. But within the sort of the regional policy divisions, we don't see, it's not so clear yet exactly how things will unfold. And in Denmark, I would say that the focus seems to be more on reducing congestion in the bigger cities, and there's not so much discussion about remote work as a regional development policy tool, likely partly because of the quite different geography in Denmark. And finally, I think this issue, when we think about how we want to actually study this issue, is perhaps useful to think about a more nuanced understanding of what we think of as urban rural. So one thing that you might have noticed from all of the maps that we showed you today, they are based on averages, municipal averages. So we understand a municipality as being either urban or rural, when actually most municipalities are actually both at the same time. So the second activity of our project is to actually develop an urban rural typology that actually picks up a little bit more on these nuances by classifying at grid level rather than at municipality level. So this is an example from Finland, actually, from Sikke in Finland, who have divided basically every square kilometre of Finland into 7 classes based on their degree of rurality or urbanness. And I think once you have such classifications, it makes it possible to actually use this typology, combine it with other indicators in order to understand a little bit what's going on in different types of places, regardless of administrative boundaries. So you can see here, this graph is actually the population distribution in these 7 categories since 1980 up until 2020. And so you can see not only what type of place does most of the population live, but also how that's changed over time. And I think this kind of information can be quite useful. For example, in the current context, what we're trying to, when we're talking about perhaps, so for example, one of the findings of the previous activity that I was discussing was that, probably the most likely scenario for a lot of workers will be some kind of hybrid working arrangement. So under such a circumstance, they're perhaps not going to move too far, and that might make it useful to actually be able to look within a municipality at how people are moving around. So to give you an example, this is a map of population change. So this is similar to the maps that I was showing in the first part, with the red showing significantly shrinking municipalities and the blue showing significantly growing municipalities. And if we look here at at Vanesborg on the map here with the circle around, we see that it's significantly growing overall. But if we actually zoom in and look at the grid level data, I hope that you can see that okay, we can see that actually that population growth, it is quite concentrated. The significant population growth that we talk about, it's actually quite concentrated in the municipal centre, and that all around many parts of the municipality are actually shrinking or more stable in population. So yeah, that's just some of the work that we're doing, kind of ongoing work that's relevant to this topic. And you can find here some links to those projects, those ongoing projects. The maps that Gustaf presented, a couple of them are from our upcoming publication, State of the Nordic Region, which is basically a book full of maps about what's been going on since the COVID-19 pandemic. You can sign up to our newsmail and we'll send you a copy of that. And of course, some references for you as well. So thank you very much. And Christmas greetings as well from all of us at Nordic Region.